Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you joining us today. My name is Nicole Davey. I am the Director of Research at the National Council for Adoption, formerly the Education Manager. So excited to kind of be back in the webinar sphere working with you guys today. We are really looking forward to this insightful webinar where we're bringing together a diverse panel of individuals who have gone through the deeply personal process of adopting after experiencing infertility. First, we want to thank ARC Fertility for grant funding this presentation. We are so grateful for their generous contribution to making this continuing education webinar happen. They are really dedicated to ensuring that there are educational resources for families who are looking to form their families in so many different ways. And then just for a moment, I would love to pass it over to Dr. David Adamson to share a few words with you about ARC Fertility and their passion for this important issue.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here again with the National Council for Adoption team. We're really very proud sponsors of and partners with your organization because we believe that adoption is such an important aspect of family forming for so many people. As we know, some people decide to adopt as their very first choice to have a family, and works out really wonderfully for them. Many people, of course, don't get pregnant on their own and do fertility care. And of course, while many take a baby home, not everyone does. And so adoption is very important for those who have been on a fertility journey when it has not worked out the way they wanted it to. And that's why this webinar is really important. I think that it's important to recognize there's a sense of loss if someone wants a family and it's not happening, and then it's a sense of loss if you try to make it happen and it still doesn't happen. And so having treated thousands and thousands of patients, I think it's really important for people to look at all their options for having a family. I know that my patients got families in very many different ways. And so I think it's really important in a webinar like this to understand what the process is like for adoption and how it can work out in such a wonderful way for you. And it is a very and can be a very challenging journey, whether it's fertility care or whether it's adoption. We wish you much success in your journey. And I know the information you received today is going to be very helpful. So good luck to you. And I know it's going to be a wonderful webinar today.
I would love to pass it over to our moderator, Tracy Newell, to get started and give our panelists an opportunity to introduce ourselves. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Nicole. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute joy to be coming alongside these other panelists today. I have to tell you, this particular subject is one that I believe does not get enough attention. So what an incredible opportunity we have been given. This is a complex subject, infertility and adoption. There are myriad emotions swirling around this subject. So I absolutely love that this is a lived experience panel who will be so sensitive to your own emotions and feelings and needs as we tackle some difficult questions today. All right, so let's get the professional stuff out of the way. I am Tracy Newell. I am on staff at Lifeline Children's Services in Birmingham, Alabama. I am also a licensed social worker and child welfare practitioner and have been for more than 20 years now. But I think the more important part of my God-given story is that my husband and I walked through years of infertility before welcoming our first forever daughter into our home through adoption. So I am a mama through adoption and a woman who has lived infertility. So with that, let's go on to our next panelist. Heather, would you start us off?
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here today. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey to adoption. So I started trying to get pregnant when I was 37. I knew it was a little bit older, but, thought, well, other people are doing it. I'm sure it'll work out. And after 6 months, it was really clear that there was something going on with my system that wasn't quite right. And so I started down that avenue of so many fertility tests. I actually ended up then having 2 miscarriages. And through the next 3 years, I was actually able to get pregnant with the help of a million fertility meds. And I did have my first child through my own body. But I was so traumatized by the process that I went through, all the fertility testing, the treatments, the losses, even my own pregnancy and birth, that we knew we wanted a second child. And there was absolutely no way that I was putting my body through that again. I still felt, I was still working through the grief of fertility and the losses. And I, even though I did then have a child that I very much wanted, I knew I could never do that again. So my husband and I decided, we've always been open to adoption. So I think that that's the route we want to go when we want to have another child. And so I, still had this grieving process of how it's so hard to just have a child and why is it so hard to do all of this. But I sought out therapy, and we did a lot of healing work around this. And then when we decided to adopt, we went the route of finding a private adoption lawyer and doing a private adoption. And it was definitely a journey. There were ups and downs, there were scams, and there was disappointment, and there was, it's a different kind of roller coaster, I call it. But in the end, we connected with the woman who became my daughter's birth mother. And she is now 5 years old, and she is the greatest joy in our life, along with my other son. But she's such a gift in a totally different way. And I just feel really joyous and honored to be her mother. And my experience with going through infertility and having a child on my own, through me, and going through adoption, it's just made it really clear that being a mother to someone that you love and take care of and cherish is what this is all about. If I had known this before, I may not have pushed so hard through all the infertility treatments, because it was taking such a toll on me. But this was my journey, and it ended with adoption. It's just been the most wonderful experience for us. We have a relationship with her birth family. We go visit them once a year. And that's been like an extra extended family in our lives. So I am here to share the ups and the downs and answer questions. And there's certainly a lot of grief along the way and a lot of challenge along the way, but getting through it to the other side. I mean, hopefully all of us on this panel can show that there is another side. I always used to say that through infertility and, trying to find my daughter, that it was just hell. I was living in hell. There was no other way for me to describe it. I was isolated. I was scared and miserable. And sometimes I'm still shocked that I'm not still there, but there is another side once you get through. So I'm here to share that as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, Julie, I think you are up next.
Hi, it is wonderful to be here today. Thanks for having me. My name is Julie Eder. I have 2 adopted children. Like many couples, my husband and I just thought we would have children, right? It's natural. It's supposed to just happen. Unfortunately for us, we had many years of infertility getting there. So we tried to conceive for 4 years and did not. And then after 4 years, could conceive, but just ended in miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. And it was really unexplained. We never could pinpoint, and still can't. I had a surprise pregnancy and miscarriage even just a few years ago, and it's still just very unexplained. We know there's something hormonal going on, but we don't really know what it is. So after that 7 years, and after a particularly difficult miscarriage, my doctor just looked at me and said, I don't know how to help you, because we're not quite sure what's going on. We had tried very general fertility treatments because we didn't quite know what was happening. And he said, if you want a child soon, all I can recommend is that you guys would pursue adoption. And it was interesting because him telling me that was kind of like it's like a sigh of relief, because now I could just put my focus on something else for a bit, So my obsession with infertility transferred to an obsession with adoption, and just all the research and things that I could. We adopted our oldest child, Isaac, who is 26, and when he was 2 days before his second birthday. And then went on to continue to struggle and have problems because we didn't know. I did not take the route as Heather, and I probably could have saved myself a lot of a lot of pain if I had. But we just continued to go on and try to figure out what was going on. We did have 3 biological children over a 10-year span, but again, just miscarriage after miscarriage in between all of those. Our final child, our 5th child, we always wanted to adopt again because we didn't want Isaac to be the only different person in our home. He is African-American and Dominican. And so we did not mean to wait for so long, but because of all of the health issues I was having, it just was never it didn't seem like a good time. And we had someone approach us who wanted to place a child for adoption and knew that we had adopted and that we were open to adopting again. So that now we have our baby, our 16-year-old Polynesian, who's Hawaiian and Samoan. So I say baby and giggle because he's huge. But yeah, that is, and kind of like I said, our adoption and infertility struggle that we never really figured out. When we were about to adopt Isaac, some good friends who had walked a very similar story to ours said to us, adoption is not a cure for pregnancy. It can be a cure for parenting, but it's not a cure for pregnancy. And I remain so incredibly thankful for those words to me, because we naively can go into adoption after infertility thinking it's going to solve all of our pains and our heartaches and everything. We're going to have this Disney story. And just having someone that had walked it before me to let me know it's great, you're going to have a child that you love, and there's still going to be a darkness in your heart that you have to grieve. And so that was incredibly helpful. My oldest son, Isaac, he has his own story with adoption, but he and I both have just done a ton of healing, because as he came to his teenage years and was really struggling with the awkwardness of a transracial adoption and being different, he really struggled with that a lot. And in his young adult years, he started his own business called Identity. And he and I have since started a podcast, Inside Transracial Adoption. And I would say that podcast, just doing that together, whether it's helpful for anyone who listens to it or not, has brought about so much healing for he and I, me from a adoptive parent side, and he from understanding his identity and just the reality of our story.
Wow, Julie. Okay, thank you very, very much. And last but not least, Jordan.
So I also struggled with infertility. I feel like one of the main differences with me is that I always knew that I didn't need to be pregnant in order to be a mom, because I am the oldest in a Black household. If you are a Black or a brown girl, you know what it's like. You have been the mom for forever. So I always had this like nurturing essence about me. I have a ton of cousins and everything. So I've been taking care of babies for as long as I could remember. But then when my husband and I, before we even got engaged, we had the talk about, okay, so what happens if we can't get pregnant? How do we feel about adoption? How do we feel about surrogacy? Like all of the ifs. And we were both planning to adopt before we had met each other. Like his best friend growing up was adopted. My best friend in high school was adopted. We had like a transracial adoptee family that lived across the street, and my mom used to help the mom teach her how to do her daughter's hair. And I went to prom with the transracial adoptee. So adoption was always in our lives. So when we were trying, and so we were like the 27 when I started getting like all the infertility tests because we couldn't figure out what was going on. And I was like, I am in the best shape of my life. Like I'm so healthy. I was working at like a health food store. I thought like I'm gonna make the healthiest environment to grow a baby in. And it didn't happen and we couldn't figure out why. But since we had already had the conversation beforehand, when we got the call that the chances of us conceiving naturally happened, we gave ourselves like a day to sit and sulk about it because it's still a sting to hear, you know, when you like really want to have children and then they call you and say like, sorry, it's just not going to happen. So we tried for a few years naturally. I was too scared to go through with IVF. We looked into the InvaCell, which is like the less invasive version, but I think I came across a YouTuber's video showing like the bruises from the injections, and I was like, I don't think I can do that. So then after a few years of trying, my husband was like, look, if nothing happens this cycle, we're going to start looking into adoption agencies. So I said, all right. And just like Julie, I did a bunch of research beforehand. I think I spent like 6 or 7 months just exclusively doing research on adoption before we started calling agencies. And then once we announced on Instagram that we were starting the process to adopt, I did it just so people stop asking me like, why aren't you pregnant yet? Are you pregnant yet? Like, when are you going to have a baby? Why aren't you guys having a baby? And then the messages turned into, oh, we're also struggling with infertility. We're also looking into adoption. Like, can you help us? And so since then, I've just been helping other Black families throughout the process of adoption because it's a very like secretive thing of like struggling with infertility within the Black community. So now after we've adopted our son, it just kind of like catapulted. They're like, oh, a Black family that adopted a Black baby. Like, this is so amazing because you don't see it too often in the media. Like those stories don't really go viral. So now I have an organization where I help other Black, biracial, and interracial families throughout the process and figure out what resources they have access to and connect them with agencies and attorneys and everything so that hopefully more people can learn about adoption and figure out like, you know, like what we can do to help strengthen families and give as many children loving and safe homes as possible.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. You know, it's never lost on me, and I have met so many couples and families over the years who have walked through infertility and who've ended up adopting their children, that our stories are so uniquely different. I mean, our journeys really contain different steps, but infertility and adoption are really uniters. And what I mean by that is we hear common threads, don't we? Although there are differences, there is really a sense of loss that most people who have experienced infertility or even who enter into adoption have walked through. So that really leads us to our first broad category. And the way this panel is structured is we are going to try to tackle several general categories, but we'll have specific questions involved in each of those. And then panelists, as we discussed earlier, I will open the floor to any of you to chime in and answer as you feel led. So the first very important topic we are looking at is processing grief and loss. Now, we had a number of questions submitted before the webinar today, so I'd like to look at a couple of those just off the bat, if I could. Someone wrote, does one ever truly get over not being able to have the biological family they envisioned?
I'll say that I think it just changes. For some people, they don't. They still feel like they need to give birth. But for most people, at least the ones that I've come across, it just changes your idea of what your family will look like. Because like you said, like it is grief and it is loss. You have to grapple with the loss of what you thought your family would look like. Because, you know, when you're dating somebody, you talk about like, oh, our kids are going to look like this, and maybe they'll have your nose and maybe they'll have your ears. But with adoption, you never know what the child is going to look like. Even if you've seen pictures of their parents, they still might not look like their biological parents. So I knew that it was going to be different. But then like eventually it got to the point where I was just like, okay, so when I would go to my physicals, are you guys gonna let me get a hysterectomy this time? And they'd be like, no. I'm like, well, I can't get pregnant. I'm not going to carry a baby to term, so you might as well just take it out. And they're like, no, you're too young. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. So there were other physical things that really maybe complicated this for you, Jordan.
Yeah, it's it's just crazy how all of it happens. And it really is like, you really have to sit with yourself and think like, am I going to be the best person to do this? Because adoption is still not for everyone. And so, like, like you have your children, and then for some of the panelists who have like their biological children and they have their adoptive children, sometimes even how you choose to parent changes when you have an adoptee, because you have to think of like, oh, are we supposed to let them cry it out? Or, when should we introduce them to a babysitter? Because you have to think about all of the nuances that come along with being an adoptee. So if you're somebody who thinks like, yeah, like we're going to travel all the time, we're going to leave our kids with grandparents and we're going to go on vacations, but then your adoptee ends up having like severe separation anxiety and you can't figure out why. And it's like, oh, because they might think that you might not come back for them. So you have to think about all the different ways that your life will be different outside of just, oh, we have a baby for you. Can you guys come to the hospital? It's so much more past that a lot of people don't take into consideration. So I'm like, yes, you have to really sit and think about all of the possibilities and all of the ways that your life will change once you start this process.
Yeah, and Jordan, the word process is so apt there, and so just so good, because it's impossible really to imagine all the scenarios on the front end. So as we go along, as we parent in adoption, we learn our children's needs. But you are so right. There are distinct differences in biological parenting and parenting through adoption, but there are similarities as well. I want to park on that question for a few minutes longer. It's such an important one. Do you, Heather and Julie, want to add to that? And the question again was, does one truly ever get over not being able to have the biological family that they envisioned?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I did go on to have some biological children, but even that has been different than what I envisioned, because we all have what our parenting philosophies are set out ahead of time. There are certain ways that we were raised that we think we're going to pull into our family, and having an adopted child first changed all of that for us. I remember one of the books, because I am just a huge researcher, that I read, there was a chapter on adoption. It was just a parenting book. It's the first sentence was something like, the first thing you need to do when you decide to adopt a child is throw out all the parenting books, kind of thing, because exactly with what Jordan was saying, you don't know what you're dealing with. And there's, you're trying to provide trust and safety and security, and the avenue for providing that can look different with every child. So in our community, we really parented all of our kids, our biological and adopted kids, with that thought in mind. And it meant that our parenting and our discipline and things that were allowed or not allowed or whatever looked very different than what we thought it was going to look. And quite frankly, was judged from the outside world sometimes, because our most important thing was, does this child feel safe? And so that was the first question we asked when we dealt with anything. And so that was very different from what we pictured ourselves doing, because it just wasn't what, obviously every child should feel safe. That's every parent's goal, right? But when you're parenting children that have not began their life in trauma, because that's what every adoptive child has had, they're the start of their life, or their adoption is always trauma. if you've never had to experience that, you don't know it's hard to know what to bring to the table when you haven't experienced it.
And also, Julie, I think you bring up an important point, talking about extended family members and those maybe who don't have the same knowledge. Maybe they haven't researched adoption quite as extensively, or infertility for that matter. Sometimes the lack of knowledge or information they bring can exacerbate the feelings of loss that we as the parents feel. So I would say to those exploring adoption, if infertility has been part of your story, prepare for that and have those conversations with your loved ones on the front end. Okay, let's move on to another question. And this one is really interesting, ladies. I love it because it's representing the dads, the fathers who are online today. And you've shared a little bit about some of your spouses and their experience, but the question is, what is the emotional impact on the father experiencing infertility? What have you observed? I will tell you, just early on, when we knew that we were walking through infertility, I had this response to Mark, my husband. I expected him to carry the weight of everything for me. I mean, he was really taking that on in a sense that I felt I just couldn't do. I thought that if he ripped open his shirt, there would be a big S for Superman there. And I know now I just did not give him the margin, the freedom to grieve. So how about you, ladies? What has the emotional experience for the father been?
I'll speak on that. So for my husband, he had his own process of feeling grief and feeling scared, and then also feeling it wasn't that big of a deal because it's going to happen. You know, he had phases of that. And for me, I was just a mess, and I kind of wanted him to be in it with me a lot, like feel all the terrible things that I'm feeling so I don't feel so alone. But that wasn't possible because I had my own very unique experience. It was my body that couldn't do this thing that I was expected to do so easily. So it was a hard time because I think we both felt alone at times, and then there were both times that we felt like we were in the grief together. And I think that's looking back, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It's to be expected. He can't feel what I'm feeling. He has to be able to have his own experience of it. There were also times where I was fearful of, I can't have a baby. I never thought he was going to leave me, but it was, is he mad at me secretly? My insecurity would pop up. Is he blaming me? Is he having all these terrible feelings about me that he's just not saying, then that's my concern. And so there was some reassurance that would happen in that realm. But he struggled with it. And then after one of our losses, he started having panic attacks, and it started coming up for him and in a different way. So at that point, we were in grief counseling together, and we were also doing therapy on our own, which was very, very helpful, and it felt really necessary for us. But it was clear at that point when he started having the panic attacks that, okay, he's been holding things in, trying to hold it in for me because I was grieving so hard, and he's got some stuff. And I also had to, and wanted to make room for that and see that and, and kind of be there for him as well. So that's, the infertility was a challenge for him. I will add in that my husband was so excited to adopt, and he couldn't care less that our daughter is not biologically related. He actually prefers it because he didn't have a good childhood. He'll joke around about that. Like, I'm glad she doesn't have all this stuff that I brought into the world that came down through my family. And he just feels 1000% like her dad. Like, there's just, for him, it's so simple.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I am just her dad. And so he feels really good about the choices that we've made.
Oh, Heather, thank you for sharing. I love how you said that there were opportunities for you and your husband to come together, and there were sweet moments coming from such a difficult place. The one thing that I really try to emphasize to married couples, specifically walking through infertility, is just keep those lines of communication open. It's not okay for us to assume that the other person is not feeling, they're feeling something. So communicating constantly with one another is going to be so important, and it's actually going to prepare you for later communication with your own children, actually. With that, let's segue into the next big topic. And I think everyone on the panel will say, yes, ma'am, let's explore this a little, which is seeking support before, during, and after adoption. Okay, panelists, just with a thumbs up, how important is this? Really important? Yes. Oh, 2 thumbs up, Julie. Okay, and Heather, really important. So the first question related to this category is, how can agencies support families coming to adoption after a long journey with infertility? So for practitioners online today, get your notepads out. How can agencies support families coming to adoption after a long journey with infertility?
I can start with that if that's okay. I think exactly what you're doing right now, infertility and adoption. And, I have now parented Isaac from, his toddler years, and now he's an adult who has his own child and has given me my wonderful first grandson. So I've kind of walked this, through many stages with him. And I would say out of anything I've experienced in my life, it has been the loneliest path from the infertility and the adoption side of it. Because of what we said earlier, just so many people don't understand. They just don't understand. And there's a sense of also trying to protect, it's his story to tell. The infertility story is many times very private. And so, you want to be able to have understanding without having to betray the confidence of your spouse or your story, or then once you adopt your children. And so I just providing support and shared stories, experiences, just because it's so incredibly lonely, or that was my experience, at least.
Okay, very good, very good. How about you, Jordan? Let me throw this one to you.
I think it's very important. And I think that there are different ways that you can go about doing it. So like with our agency, I feel like what they probably should have done, well, I think what most agencies should do is like initial counseling session for couples who are coming in after infertility. Because a lot of places, especially going through the home study process, a lot of the times they just get you home study approved and that's it. And a lot of people that I've seen will say, okay, we just had our 5th miscarriage. Now we're looking into adoption. And I'm like, whoa, hold on. You still have your medical bracelet on. Like, we need to pump the brakes here. You need to actually take time, heal physically first, and then start thinking about like, okay, are you just making a rush decision because you just want to have a baby? Or do you actually want to be a parent? Because they're only a baby for so long. And then before you know it, they're a toddler that's very vocal about that they want the blue cup and they're not drinking out of the green one, no matter what you tell them. And so for a lot of people, they struggle with getting to the different age ranges. And then like during the adoption process, I think that there should be more support, because a lot of the times it's like, you got your home study and that's it. Then now you're just submitting for situations. They're not doing anything in the meantime to help you prepare for a potential scammer, or preparing you for when a mom changes her mind, because we've had scams and we've had moms who have changed their mind, and the agency was just kind of like, oh, well, it happens. And we're like, what do you mean it happens? We didn't know anything about it. Like, our first match was a scammer. And then we had multiple scammers from there, in between trying to match with our agency and then trying to self-match. And then the disruptions are just like, oh, well, moms change their minds all the time. It's normal. And we're like, well, you didn't tell us that when we signed on. So we're not really sure about what's going to happen. And then after we got placed with our son, his social worker retired, then our social worker retired. And it was just like, okay, congratulations. Goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the other post-adoption education I've had to get on my own by listening to audiobooks and listening to podcasts and doing research myself. And it's just kind of like, I feel like there should be more, I don't know if it's support groups or just education, because even if it was just like a monthly Zoom call with other families that are also signed on with the agency who are going through the same thing, I feel like it would have felt a little bit more like a community or more supportive, as opposed to you don't hear anything until a mom comes through that's looking for you, because it's like, okay, hurry up, finish your home study. And then you go months without hearing from the social worker. And it's
Yeah.
like, I have a situation. Oh, sorry, the mom's a scammer. And then months without hearing from anyone. So I think that you should definitely, if the agency that you're working with doesn't provide it, then you yourself have to do some research to try to figure out, and this is my son here. So you can get that support yourself, because you're always going to be learning about adoption through all the different stages of their life.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Jordan, excellent. There are so many good questions coming in on the chat. I want to address one, a social worker who wrote, how can I support a family who has walked through infertility? And I want to speak to practitioners and social workers online today. I think that the very first place you start is asking the question, how are you doing? Working in a social services agency for years, I've encountered so many social workers who are afraid of that question. They're afraid of digging up the grief for adopting parents. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing and causing further harm. But you can actually facilitate those discussions just by asking, how are you doing? And to Jordan's point earlier, taking the time before moving to the next step to really make sure that they are okay and ready to take the next step. Okay, so Heather, I am going to bring you in at this point because we have another question in this category. What do you wish adoption professionals knew about adoption after infertility? So what do you wish adoption professionals knew about adoption after infertility?
So I'll piggyback off of what Jordan was saying. If someone going through infertility and then maybe saying this doesn't work out and switching directions and wanting to go to adopt, and I experienced some of that myself. I did have moments where I was like, I just have to go to the next thing. I need to have a child. I'm just like, I don't process anything. I just want to move forward. And that wasn't healthy for me. And I had to kind of stop and do a lot of grieving. But I think it's that, to know that there is grief there and there's a desire to have a child and move forward, and both of them can exist. But if you're not going into the adoption with kind of as clear of a mind as you can and clarity about what adoption is, this is not just a way to get a baby. It's a whole different journey as a parent. So I think that professionals just need to know that, and to maybe be able to recognize if someone has grieved and is ready to move on versus they just want to go to the next thing because they can't stop the train, stop I need to get to the next thing. I need to get the baby. And I totally understand that. And I don't have any judgment around it because I lived that, but it's not healthy for the parents that are going into this. And it's not healthy for the adopted child that will come into their life. So I think recognizing that, and then, I mean, it depends on the form. If it's a therapist or if it's a group, or, there's different ways, I guess, for professionals to handle that. But I think noticing that effect is probably really the big thing, I would say.
Heather, very well said. Certainly, we have learned about the grieving process, and ladies, you've experienced it, is that difficult feelings can come back. There's this bouncing that takes place. And while those grieving emotions may continue, Heather, to your point. Couples really can, individuals walking through infertility really can reach a place of acceptance. And I think the adoption professional's role in that, one of their unique roles is to help him or her or them get there, that place of acceptance, that this is part of our story. It may not be what we dreamt of from the beginning, but we are here and now we want to take the next step with you. All right, let's move on. Yes, Jordan.
Another thing that I feel like should be kind of gone across the board, it's the cultural competency of hopeful parents, because so many people have fought for so long to try to get pregnant that they get to the point they're like, well, I just want a baby. I don't care what they look like, where they come from. I just want a baby. And that's all fine when they're small. But like Julie said, that her son started struggling when he became a young adult as being, you know, a Black man in America. And a lot of people, if you don't have any Black friends or Black family members, you don't really understand a lot of what's happening within the Black community. And the Black Lives Matter movement during the pandemic was a huge eye-opener for a lot of people who didn't realize, like, oh, wow, these people are being harassed just by riding their bike in the neighborhood. Like, I didn't understand that these types of things could happen. But if you only live in a community where it's only white people in, you know, within 100 square miles, where if a Black child goes there, they're going to be the only Black child in the family, in the neighborhood, in the school. So they're going to end up having a hard time, especially once they hit like that preschool, kindergarten age, when they kind of realize like, oh, I don't look like everybody else here. So I think they need to take into consideration that, because a lot of racist people do adopt children of color, and they don't really take into consideration that you can't just love away someone's ethnicity, and no matter how much you want them to be, you know, to fit into what your family looks like, they're not going to. Like, they're always going to be African American, they're always going to be South Asian. So even if you change their names, or, you know, just try to pretend that you don't see it, they see it, and everyone else around them sees it as well.
So Jordan, perhaps a unique role there of the worker is to help those parents, prospective parents, imagine at a minimum the next 18 years with their child. Yeah. What is this going to look like along the way, along the continuum? Julie?
I was just going to say, we had the unique experience of Isaac was leaving his teenage years as my white son was beginning his teenage years. And that was all in the middle of Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and all of that. And it was such providential timing, I feel like, because I was able to see firsthand that, whoa, I'm not having the same conversations with my white teenage son that I had to have with my Black teenage son. Mm-hmm. And so there was no denying, like there was absolutely no denying what was going on there. And that was kind of like the catalyst for healing in our relationship with Isaac, because I was able to say, I'm so sorry. I, in my white ignorance, have really, I'm going to cry actually, sorry as I say this, because it's still just so painful for me that we missed so much. But to be able to say that to him was huge. So I would go so far back to the original question that I wish that it were realistic, that therapy all the way through, from acknowledging the infertility grief through adult adoptee, that it could somehow be mandatory. Because there's just so much cyclical grief that pops up from day one.
Yeah.
That
very well said.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good, Julie. And I don't know, ladies, if you are seeing the comments as they're coming in, but people are very passionate about this, and they're saying this is huge. This is huge. And with that, we have to move on to the next category. I hated, guys, that, I mean, we could spend hours on these things, but with our limited time, let's look at the challenges moving ahead. What are some of those emotional, resource, financial challenges that adopting parents may face down the road? So the lead-in question here is, how can we evaluate that someone has processed as much as possible their infertility and how it may impact them in adoption? So to the best of our ability, how can we evaluate that someone has processed or maybe has resolved some of the complicated emotions surrounding infertility?
I don't know how you figure out if someone has processed anything fully. I don't even know if someone can say that for themselves, but as someone else said before, I think that it's a level of acceptance, that not just someone saying, I accept I'm infertile, now let me go get a baby from adoption. You can, if it's someone working with a professional, you can tell when someone, where it's landed in their body, that they have accepted that this is what my journey is. And acceptance comes with a lot of tears and maybe some anger. It comes with a lot, but there's a level of, okay, this is where I am, and I can feel that and see that. And when I move forward to look at adoption, they're looking at adoption as ready to explore adoption for what it is, and not, like I said before, just to get a baby. So they're ready to say, okay, here, this is what happened in my infertility journey, and it sucks, and I might grieve it for a long time, but I've accepted that this is not how I'm having a child. And then take the next step to evaluate, do I want to continue trying to have a child? Do I want to look at adoption? What is adoption? And they can really look at it and not bring all the baggage into it. But we all have the infertility baggage. I'm not saying that ever goes away fully. I mean, there's still, when I hear but someone got pregnant on they tried for 1 month and they got pregnant, it still feels like, ugh, screw you. There's still a little bit of that there, but it doesn't consume me. It's like a little thought, and then I move on with my life.
It has become less consuming.
Yeah, it doesn't consume me at all now. But I think that I don't want to make it sound like you process it and then you don't think about it or feel it. You still will feel the pain of infertility.
Yeah.
But it's the acceptance of it.
Okay, with that, ladies, just a continuation of that question, such an important one coming at you right now. How can infertility impact your adoption experience? So how might it impact the kiddos being placed in your home?
Sorry, you go ahead.
I've seen, because I follow a lot of adoptees on social media. So I read a lot of their books and stuff like that, so I can hear from their side. And one of the things that I've seen in quite a few of them is that they always feel like they have to live up to the expectation of what the biological child would have been like. And like, oh, well, personality wise or interest, like that type of stuff. Like, would you think like, oh, well, if I like basketball, then my kids are going to like basketball. Well, my son's a great swimmer. He's okay he likes basketball, but not like I did growing up. So I'm like, okay, well, he likes to swim, so we're going to put him in swim. And a lot of people don't realize that it's like I said, like you have to really just understand that it's going to be different no matter what way you spin it, because it's just like you really just have to throw what you thought your life would be like out of the window, because you can't take what you hoped for your biological children and try to pressure or like put that pressure on your adoptive children to live up to that expectation. Because I've seen them where they're just like, like I was just never enough for my mom, no matter how hard I tried, because she still held on to the fact that she was never able to have her own biological children. So I spent my entire life trying to please her and impress her, and it was just never enough, no matter what I did. I'm just like, oh, because I know our son, like the sun rises and sets on that child. Like we are obsessed with him. So for somebody to grow up knowing that they were always seen as second best or like a last resort, it is truly heartbreaking, and that should never be the case. But that's what else.
Yeah.
Jordan, just excellent. Yes, Julie.
I would say one of the things too that Isaac and I have actually just recently unpacked, we had the whole very typical, he's mad at the mother figure, so he's going to take that anger out on me. So we had that whole, few years of that happening. But one of the things that we also realized recently, he had just severe trust issues and attachment issues. So he has spent his, large part of his life just pushing away. What can I do to prove to you that you don't love me and I can't attach to you so that I can be right and I can be, cocoon into my safe world by pushing you away. Where I am the infertility mom who has suffered many, many, many pregnancy losses. And so while he's pushing away, I am just like trying to grab on and hold on really tight, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So both of our insecurities were working against one another. And that way it can be working for one another because I'm trying to grab on tight while he's trying to prove me wrong and that kind of thing. But it kind of smothered him and it kind of made him spend a lot of time feeling guilty for having adoption grief. Because the more I tried to hold tight, for him, when he was not able to express what he was feeling, it just made him feel guilty, kind of thing.
Oh, Julie, just excellent. I mean, unknowingly, I think that we as parents can sometimes project our own grief and feelings of insecurity onto our children. And so we do have to be very careful about that. And hence the importance of open communication throughout this process, right? With everyone involved, spouse, worker, loved ones. Okay, this is not entirely a departure, ladies, from what we have been discussing, but I know it's important to our audience. What about those resource and financial challenges that you have encountered? If we could briefly speak to that.
I guess I'll start. I think the financial aspect is tough because if you've already started infertility and, like most of us, just going to see your reproductive specialist, it could be a couple $100s for every visit. And then they want you to come back in to look at your paperwork. So before you know it, you're spending thousands of dollars just on blood work and appointments that really could have been an email. And so if you actually go through with the infertility treatments, then you're like, okay, $10,000 to $15,000 per cycle plus medication. And before you know it, you've blown through your entire savings. Then you start getting fee structures from adoption agencies, and they're running anywhere from $30,000 to $80,000. And a lot of them don't offer refunds if the mom changes her mind or if she's a scammer. So you're thinking like, okay, do we sell the house and then use the equity of the house to help pay for this? Do we take out a loan? If your company doesn't offer any type of adoption assistance, but you make too much money to qualify for grants, but you really don't have that much money because you spend so much of it on infertility treatments, then you're in a really rough spot because maybe you just have enough to be able to adopt once, and then the mom changes her mind, and then you lost your $30,000, and then you're just kind of struggling like, okay, well, I don't know what to do from here. So I do think there needs to be like some more help and when it comes to the financial aspect of it, because it's really expensive.
Yeah, it really is.
It's expensive.
Certainly the emotional impact of that financial piece can be quite profound too. I'm seeing couples adopting become more and more creative in the way that they raise funds. There are certainly grants and resources available, and perhaps NCFA, we could get some of that information to attendees today. With that, we have to move along. So our next broad category, ladies, is having those all-important conversations with your children. What are some of the adoption/infertility conversations that you have had with your kiddos throughout the years?
Julie, you're more prepared to speak on this because your kids are older. I was just going to say my daughter's only 5. So we have very small conversations about, she knows her name, but we grew in, this person's belly, and she has some questions, and sometimes she doesn't want to hear about it at all. I get a lot of pushback, and so we leave it alone. And then we revisit it, and we have some adoption books that we read, and I just kind of bring it in at the pace it seems like she's ready for it. I've also learned that. I was surprised by that. I thought, doing the right thing. She's young. She's always going to know she's adopted. I mean, we visit her birth family, but she still sometimes didn't want to hear about it. So, you know, I've learned to take her lead a little bit. She's a very strong-minded little girl, and she knows what she's ready for, and she knows what she's not. So that's where we are with it as a 5-year-old.
Yeah, we are a all things are on the table at all times type of family. So we never wanted our adopted kids to remember the day they were told they were adopted. So, you know, my youngest, Micah, I was at the hospital when he was born, and as an infant, I'm whispering to him about being adopted and, you know, things like that. We just never wanted them to remember that. That doesn't mean that they don't come to the day where they realize what that actually means, you know. So there's a difference between knowing the vocabulary and then actually owning what that actually means one day. So that's still a thing. It's interesting. My kids have known our infertility story. We've never hidden it. Like I said, all things on the table at all times. For Isaac, I think it took becoming a parent for him to truly realize what grief we must have gone through. And so it's kind of, again, just been a healing thing. So I guess the theme of the things I have to say today is that adoption is hard and fertility is hard, but if you can protect that relationship, you get to the adult phase and beautiful, beautiful healing can take place. And we have just been experiencing that the past few years, and it's been absolutely beautiful. But yeah, they've always known it. We haven't hidden anything from them. But I would say he's just starting to understand that. Yeah. So
my son, he's only 5 also, but like he knows what I do. He knows I help families adopt, and he went with me to the National Council for Adoption conference in Fort Worth in June. So he was very excited. It's like, oh, everyone here works for adoption. Like, that's so cool. And a little ribbon that said board member. So second day, he was telling people that he was the board member for the adoption conference. So for him, he likes the idea of adoption, but, you know, again, he's only 5. That might change when he gets older. But yeah, so he knows that he was in someone else's stomach, and he understands just enough of it because he's really getting to the point where he's like asking about pregnancy and stuff, because he had a friend whose mom was pregnant and we saw her, and he was like, oh, so-and-so's mom has a baby in her belly. Do you have a baby in your belly? And I was like, no, my belly doesn't make babies. And then he was like, oh, why not? We have to have the talk about it again. And so I feel like it's a never ending conversation, because as they get older, there's more information that they find out. And then sometimes there's even more information that you find out as a parent that you didn't know about until you're older, and then you start having more conversations with the biological family. So, and then, you know, like as they grow, things always change. Their feelings about things change. So he thinks it's cool now, but, you know, when he's 10, he might not.
Amen, Jordan. Okay.
Real quick, I'm so sorry. In the world of the internet, once they become teenagers, they can find out anything that they want to know. And you don't want that to happen. You want to be the one that tells them everything that they need to know.
You want to be your child's informant.
That's not my biological father on the internet.
Yeah. So ladies, I've heard so many important things. I heard that information changes. It's this interesting transition from this very concrete way of thinking to more abstract. Our kids are able to conceptualize adoption a little better as they go along and their thinking changes. But you, Heather, were the first one to say, I have just allowed my child to take the lead. And ladies, have you also found that many times our children will do that they will take the lead and even initiate those discussions? And boy, that takes the heavy off of us, doesn't it? I think before we transition, just another little personal insight. When I just pulled back the curtain a little on our infertility journey with our oldest daughter, and she heard me say, we have loss in common. Like, we have loss and grief in common. It was such a uniting, bonding experience for us. And I was able to express to her in a different way, you were so wanted. You were so wanted and chosen by us. So that common loss it's not a bad thing. Okay. So in wrapping this up, ladies, what advice would you give? I think just a few seconds each. How would you advise attendees today? Golden nugget.
I would just say, think about the milestones of like, how would it be 5 years from now? How would it be 10 years from now? Whether you're pursuing infertility or pursuing adoption, and then think, if you are going to pursue adoption, don't just make it about you. Also make it about like, am I going to be the best parent for this child? And if the answer is maybe or no, then you could pass on it. And then the person that will be the best parent for that child will have the opportunity to be able to parent them. But I think when we decenter ourselves in the process, when it comes to adoption, it'll make it a lot easier for everyone involved.
Thank
And
you,
along
Julie.
those same lines, what I said earlier, adoption is not a cure for pregnancy. It's a cure for parenting, not pregnancy. And so don't put that pressure on your adopted child to be that cure, to answer that grief, to heal that grief in your heart, because that is just obviously not healthy for the child, but it's also your grief will just be prolonged in that process.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, Heather.
Seek out support in whatever way that you can. If you can go see a therapist, not everybody can see a therapist. There's so many communities online now. I did a lot of online communities because at the time that I was going through this, I wasn't living in an area with in-person infertility or adoption support groups. And I found a lot of community online on Reddit, on Facebook. There's so many people going through this as well. So if you feel alone, which all of us do in this, there are so many ways to connect. And I just think it's really important to be surrounded by other people that you can talk to and feel supported by.
Thank you, ladies. Okay, Nicole.
All right. Well, thank you guys. This was incredible. We can transition into some live Q&A. We have another about 25 minutes or so. So we're doing great on time. I think I'll start with kind of transitioning from what Heather just kind of commented on already, but maybe giving everyone an opportunity to give their own example. I know we talked a little bit about services and supports that people engaged with, and what you might even recommend for agencies to ensure that families access, but we would love to hear a little more about if there's anything specifically that you utilized, whether it's a support group, whether it's therapy, to the level at which you're comfortable sharing what that experience was like for you. And was it an infertility specific resource in the sense, like, did you feel like it was meeting that need, or maybe was it more general to adoption?
I did have an infertility support group that I went to before the adoption. And I guess my advice with that, and Jordan can probably speak more to this since you lead several groups, I think I understand. If that's true. But the specific group that I was a part of was not incredibly healthy. It wasn't led by a professional. It was just a group of us who were struggling with it at that time. And so we tended to like wallow in this. I'm not voicing what I'm trying to say very well, but it was more of a sad time than an encouraging time. And then I was the first one in the group to become pregnant and not miscarry. And so then I just lost all of those friends. They just could not handle being around me after that. And so I would just say, I think the groups, the support, I said it earlier, it was the loneliest time in my life. So important, but just making sure that they are healthy, that it's healthy groups like that.
I thought this was a great question as well that someone dropped in the chat. What do you wish your family and friends would have said to you, or how do you wish they would have interacted with you as you were navigating the infertility process, whether you pursued fertility treatment or immediately pursued adoption? Maybe give some general guidance on like what sort of conversations, language, and support that would be really ideal to receive from family and friends.
Yeah, language is really, really important. I hope that I've gotten better. I was very easily offended by people's comments, the terminology they use. own child, real parent. And just in the beginning, even corrected my own parents and saying, I am a real parent, and this is my own child. I think for those experiencing this in the audience, have that arsenal of responses ready. Instead of reacting, be prepared for people's comments or questions that can be hurtful. It is not malicious. It is not intentional. It's coming from a place of just not knowing many times, but be prepared to answer in a way that boosts the confidence of your child or your children.
I would say for me, one of the things my husband and I made sure that we said we weren't going to tell anybody our exact infertility like diagnosis. Like we would say like some general information, but everyone thinks they have a cure. And that gets very like emotionally draining when you tell everyone that you're going through the process of to adopt, and then all of a sudden I started getting Amazon links to teas and vitamins to take, and oh, talk to this doctor, and have you tried acupuncture and all this, but they didn't know that we had already gone through it for 4 years before we decided like, okay, this is what we're going to move forward to, because we thought we would adopt an older child like at elementary school age. We were never intending on newborn adoption. So when it happened, it was kind of a shock for everyone. So between that and some of the comments that I got about like, well, how does your husband feel? You know, men want their legacy, because, you know, everyone confuses lineage with legacy. And, oh, no man is really going to want to parent somebody else's child and all of that until they see my husband with our son. And those two are inseparable. So I'm like, you know, between, like you're saying, like, don't get too offended, because most people are just kind of ignorant to the whole thing. And I would just say, try to keep as much of it to yourself as you can, because that'll help protect you. Because I've had people tell me like flat out, I don't think those doctor's results are correct. I'm like, well, I had to do like 15 vials of blood for it, so I'm pretty sure they're correct. Like, I don't think that's true. So there will be a lot of people who just don't believe that infertility is actually a thing. So they'll just completely disregard it. So it will hurt your feelings, because you know that it is true because you're struggling through it. So I would say just try to protect your peace as much as possible when it comes to those things. And it'll take you very far.
That's great. Thank you, Jordan. I think that's great advice. It's a balance of, you know, giving people grace, recognizing that everyone isn't perfectly informed, and then setting the boundaries you need to set to be protective of yourself and your family, because once you adopt, you know, those comments aren't always shielded from the children in your home either. So that's really, really valuable. And I know this was sort of discussed a little bit already, but I think that like hearing even more of the specifics of your journey can be really helpful for people. I'm curious, when or how you felt like you knew in your own experience that you were ready to kind of wholeheartedly pursue adoption, and what you feel like kind of it took for you to feel that sureness about that decision.
I share Jordan's story. We always felt like we were going to adopt even before we realized we had issues. So it was not a hard transition that way, like for us to accept. It was the grief to go through, even though we felt like we would adopt at some point. But that was never a difficult thing for my husband or I to accept, that would be how we would have a child.
I think the only reason we waited as long as we did is because we were worried that people wouldn't take us seriously if we were under 30 trying to adopt, because we're worried that they would be like, oh, you guys haven't been married long enough, you don't have enough lived experience. So we're like, okay, well, maybe when we get a little bit closer to 30, if we don't end up pregnant, then maybe we won't get any people like, you know, kind of acting funny towards us. Because, you know, adoption agencies most of them are a lot older. So some people think that you should be like later 30s, because then you're more financially stable and you have your house and all those things. So we were really worried that if we were like, okay, yeah, we're 28, let's do this. And the agencies would be like, no, come back in a few years.
I'm similar to what they said. We talked about adoption even before we started trying to have a baby. So it wasn't a huge leap. I did have to be ready for it in the way of like, okay, I'm not trying to do this with my body anymore. That's done. I felt like once I could really research and look into adoption and really focus on it and be clear in that, that's how I knew, okay, we're ready to actually pursue it. Where I wasn't thinking about infertility when I was doing this research, or when it was like a shift to a different mindset, I guess.
Yeah.
I just knew that we were ready for it.
Yeah, and for us, we actually started fostering. And with reunification being the goal of foster care, we saw a number of children enter our home and then leave and go home. And that was good. And we celebrated that. But that certainly created a yearning in our hearts to have a children or to have a child who would stay, a child of our own whom we would parent forever. So I think for us, foster care was the catalyst.
Yeah. Awesome. So kind of tying back to, I know we already talked about a little bit about language and talking with friends and family, but we also received a number of questions about professionals engaging with those considering adoption after infertility. So I'm curious if there were any points in the process of your own experiences where maybe you noticed missing sensitivity, or maybe there's points where professionals would benefit from being aware of this might be more triggering for a family who's experienced infertility that might be worth kind of raising for our attendees.
I know for me, I felt like a lot of places didn't take us seriously because we were a Black family trying to adopt. We live in Texas right now, and so we all know the history of the South in America. And I really felt like when I would call an agency and let them know, like, hey, we're a Black couple, we want to adopt a Black child. For some of them, the tone would kind of change when I said that we were Black and trying to adopt a Black child. Then it immediately was, oh, you know, it's very expensive. Like they would just assume that we couldn't pay for it or we weren't planning on paying the fees for it. And I noticed with my work that I've been doing for the past couple of years is that racism is still very much well and alive, especially in private adoption. There are a lot of agencies who don't think that Black families should adopt, even if it is a Black child. There are still some people who believe in the white saviorism. The best thing you can do for a Black child is to remove them from the Black community. And that is not true at all. We were matched with an expectant mom who signed on with an agency. She told them that she was looking for a Black family, and they told her that a Black family was not going to give her child the life that she wanted for them. So I was like, okay, well, what were you looking for? And I thought she was going to say like, oh yeah, like I want a family like Tiny and T.I. who have this huge house where it's split in two. Like I thought she wanted something just astronomical. And she said she just wanted a younger family that had a house with a backyard big enough to put a swing set in. And so when she saw a picture of my husband barbecuing with our swing set in the backyard, she was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I was looking for. And I'm just like, we bought that swing set at Costco. Like it wasn't something crazy, but the fact that her just wanting somebody who had a yard big enough for a swing set was too much. And an agency said that a Black family was not going to be able to give her that really shocked me, especially because it's not like we were back in the civil rights movement. We're in 2024, but it was 2023 when it happened. But still, it's still close enough to know that, you know, we have nice houses and we have good jobs. And so for a lot of places, I think they also need to look into their own prejudice and their own biases when it comes to adoption, and that the evangelical Christian heterosexual blonde hair blue-eyed couple is not always the best fit for families. And sometimes, because you know, like I even say myself, would I be the best adoptive family for a Vietnamese child? Probably not. We don't have any Vietnamese friends. So even myself, I know what my limitations would be as far as bringing up a child from a different ethnicity. Would I love them? Absolutely. Would I learn how to cook Vietnamese food? Yes. But they would still just be like, I don't know. I don't have any Vietnamese friends. There's nobody who lives in the neighborhood who looks like me. So even if I can say that maybe this wouldn't be the best fit for me, then I feel like agencies should also look into that, especially if the mom says, I want a Black family or at least want a Black mom. I feel too many of them prioritize whoever can pay the fees, as opposed to who would be the best fit for the expectant mom and for the child. Because you have to remember, for a lot of open adoptions, the relationship with the expectant mom is a relationship that you're going to end up having for the rest of the child's life, because now y'all are all extended family. So I think that those are very important things that need to be looked into.
Yeah, thank you.
I would hope that our story is different today, because it was many years ago, 24 years ago. But we had the very colorblind guidance. So we were advised to change his name, and we were advised, look, just provide him a loving home. That's all that we just weren't guided or educated in a white family adopting a minority child. And so that would be, I hope that that's different today. But if not, that, there are many professionals in this meeting, I would say just be very careful. Color blindness does not celebrate who they were created to be. And we were very ignorant on that and did not receive good education. And I wish that we had known better at that point. Yeah.
Thank you both for sharing that. We have another question here. It says, how, as an adoption social worker, can I support families who've experienced infertility, especially if they do not recognize how their grief or experience may continue to show up throughout this process?
Yeah, just from one adoption social worker to another, again, don't be afraid to ask those difficult questions. Lean into infertility a bit. It's kind of like the elephant in the middle of the room. Couples like Mark and me who walk through infertility, we're not unaware of it. And the grief is a very real part of that. And it is okay for you to ask questions about that. I wish, in fact, that our adoption social worker doing our home study had addressed it more explicitly with us and had asked the questions, where are you in your infertility journey? How are you feeling at this point in the process? What are some of the emotions swirling around? Are you talking to one another? What is your support system like? And really investigated those things. And then to continue that conversation along the way. It's just not a one and done. It is something that continues to need to be explored.
That's great. Thank you, Tracy. We have another question here. I'm an adoption social worker with a private agency. Do you think having an advocate throughout the process and beyond the process will help reduce trauma for both adoptive family and birth family? Talking about, again, just their goal is trying to reduce those experiences for both parties.
Oh, absolutely. The more support and the longer, like you said, throughout the process, it seems like as soon as our home studies for both of our kids were done, we lost all support. Like we received no more education, no more support, no more anything. And so, advocates all along the way is hugely important and helpful, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so another question, wondering for each of your recommendations for any adoption related podcasts, books, etc. If they're adoption and fertility related, that would be even better. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have a handout we will send out to all of our attendees with a bunch of resources we've compiled related to adoption after infertility, but we would love to give you all a moment to share any that you would love to feature. Yeah, so maybe we can start with Tracy and then kind of go down the line.
Well, it's not specific to infertility, but I love The Connected Child. And probably many of you are familiar with it from Dr. Purvis and David Cross. And it's just teaching parents through adoption who are parenting kiddos from hard places, is the way they coin it, or with that history of trauma, how to connect on a very intimate and relational level. And they also invite us to explore our own attachment styles and how those impact our parenting. So it's a good read. And I see Connected Parent is wonderful as well in the chat there.
A book that helped me back then to just understand what was going to happen after infertility and the emotional road of adoption was called Adoption Blues, and how they're very similar to postpartum blues. And so that was just, I don't even know if it's in print anymore. It's a long time ago. It was an old book then. so I don't know, but that was a very helpful book to me. I mentioned my son's company Identity earlier, that he started as a transracial adoptee. They just come out with this guide, Adoption After Infertility. And I interviewed the author of this guide on the podcast Inside Transracial Adoption just a couple of months ago. So this book, even for me, who's not dealing with it anymore, was extremely helpful. Just reading, and again, just someone else's story that was similar to mine, and I felt not alone. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Jordan, do you have any that you want to add? I know.
I heard one podcast. It's called the Unwanted Sisterhood podcast. And it's about, infertility, the struggles of that, and becoming a mom. Because the lady who started it, I think her and her husband spent like over $100,000 on infertility treatment between their savings, loans, fundraising, all the things. So I think that was a good one to listen to. I can't remember if she's still doing it, but there's enough episodes on there to where you can get a good idea as far as like, just knowing that you're not crazy. This is real. And this is a struggle that so many other people are going through, even if they're not as vocal about it, because a lot of people just are kind of private. And I noticed that a lot of people have a stigma around it, and then you feel embarrassed because everyone can get pregnant very easily. I'm 1 of 5, and I just thought like fertility was hereditary, and I was like, well, my grandma had 4, and then my mom had 5, so I should be able to at least have 3, no problem. It was like, oh no, that is one thing I did not get from my mom. So being able to see that there are other people out there who are also going through the same thing, I think is very beneficial. And she talks to different people in different aspects, like OBGYN and adoptees and all types of people. So I think these are really good resources. And I'm going to be checking out some of these books in here also.
Thank you. I'll wrap up with one more question. It's not quite about the infertility topic as much as some of the important diversity and racial issues that Jordan has raised. We have a lot of questions about if you have any guidance, if any of you have any guidance on encouraging more minority families to consider adoption, and if you have any guidance on just addressing some of these sorts of examples you've described, like if you are a family experiencing racism from an agency organization, how can you advocate for yourself?
It is really hard because there's this myth of like the hypersexualization and like Black families and how we're so fertile. So many people just think that either we're just not trying hard enough or we're doing it wrong. And the amount of people who have tried to teach me about spending time with my husband was crazy. And they're just like, are you sure you're doing it right? I'm like, I'm pretty sure. Rather not go into details with you about it. But I think also being sure to like just looking for other people who are also in a minority community could be like one of your first ways in. So even if you just come across somebody on LinkedIn who is the same ethnicity of you that works in adoption, then maybe they have a recommendation for you. And like the whole reason why I even started this is because this is something that I wish I had, 6-7 years ago when I was going through the process myself, because I felt like when I called places, no one on the staff was a person of color, or if there was, it was only one person, and all of the people of color were on that person's caseload. So they were kind of overworked because they're the one handling all the people of color. Like, you could have more people on your staff. You could have a more diverse team here. So that way you can help people understand what it is that we are experiencing, that we're going through. But I do think that I think just the fee structure is what sets a lot of people like apart from whether or not they're going to pursue it. because they do the inquiry, they get that email that has the fee breakdown, and they're just like, oh no, I'm not going to do this. And they don't even ask any follow-up questions about like, okay, are there any grants available? How could I possibly fund this? You know, like, can I even check to see if my employer offers any type of assistance? They just assume like, oh, it's just too much, and they just walk away from it. But if they take some time to look into it more, then they can see that there's the adoption tax credit, so you can get a good chunk of that money back. They have grants and they have loans. There's some more opportunities for you if you do a little bit more of the work. But I mean, it's still going to be hard no matter what, but we could just try to make it not as difficult if possible.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to thank all of our panelists for their time. This was such an incredible and informative webinar. So we really appreciate you sharing your personal stories and your expertise for all of our attendees today. All right, that is it. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great Tuesday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.